Also, this project is something in which you will be indulging me a little bit, because it's an interest that I've had for a very long time about the way oil painting as an affect is received outside of Europe, in traditions to which there is no long-standing, into cultures in which there is no long-standing tradition of oil-based painting in oil-based pigments. And this is a project I should add that my general interest in Western-style painting in Japan was inspired by some articles by Professor Doris Plassant on Takahashi Yuichi, the painter that I'll be addressing here. So it will be a particular delight to hear her instruction after the lecture. A world history of oil painting has yet to be written. If and when it is, and I should add that I myself have no interest in writing one, a small but revealing chapter might be devoted to Takahashi Yuichi, a champion of the medium in Japan during the mid to late 19th century. And here you are viewing one of the works that I consider an extremely important work in the history of oil painting, his still life with tofu. And usually people, yes, usually there's some snickering in the audience when I say this, but just you wait and see. Now, Yuichi was not the earliest artist to explore the representational potential of oil painting in Japan, nor was he the most accomplished practitioner of oil painting in Japan. Yet through his activities as a painter and teacher, as well as through his relentless authorship of treatises, manuals, and manifestos, Yuichi played a formative role in helping to define a culture of oil painting in the archipelago, well before the systematic domestication there of art, or bijutsu, and its institutions. Now, the nature of this role, as well as the historical reception of paintings in oil-based pigments in Japan, has gone to some extent underappreciated until fairly recently. Yuichi's impact in this regard is multi-dimensional, as he was a significant voice during the 1870s in the emerging discourse on everything from the competition between various reprographic media to the public stature of portraiture and even the establishment of museums. But what I would like to focus on here is perhaps the least considered aspect of Yuichi's historical legacy, which is his focus on defining and articulating for his multiple constituencies the specific material qualities of oil painting. In this regard, his achievement has been blurred due to the general subsuming of his activities and writings under the larger rubric of a history of something known as Western painting method, Seiyo Gakko in Japan. This method, which was understood primarily in terms of linear perspective and modeling, had become an object of discourse by the 18th century in Japan, and it was the subject of numerous treatises throughout the Edo period. It was instigated by Japan's encounter with Jesuit paintings, Dutch copperplate engravings, European lithographs, Chinese prints that incorporate Western habits of pictorialism, and other miscellaneous sources. Yuichi's voluminous writings, however, which span the late 1860s until his death in 1894, make surprisingly little mention of spatial illusionism or modeling per se. Although borrowing freely from the lexicon of Edo period Western painting treatises, in particular the concept of shin, that is to say truth or essence, Yuichi's texts appear to have taken as axiomatic many of the didactic goals of these Western Edo period painting treatises. He accepted some notion of Western painting method that had been established in Japan many, many decades previously. Rather, the focus of interest in Yuichi's text can be located primarily in, I believe, three areas: either institutions, or habits of viewership, or, of greatest concern here, the materiality of oil painting, which is referred to in these texts primarily as abudare, but sometimes also as yuga or yusaiga. Now, the present paper argues that Yuichi came to understand the truth in painting, which is a phrase, of course, I borrowed from Cézanne, La Vérité en Peinture, to be located as much in the unctuous, glistening nature of the oily medium in which colorants were suspended as in any other aspect of Western pictorialism. In other words, Yuichi's pictorial and discursive output manifests an important shift from method to material in the discourse on European picture making in Japan. This emphasis on the tangibility, the palpability of oil painting came at a significant and particularly dense moment in the ongoing reception or acculturation of this tradition in Japan. While oil painting began to face acute pressure to serve the new prerogatives of utility to the modern nation-state and the quote-unquote civilization and enlightenment agenda of Japanese society, oil painting was also engaging in stiff competition with emerging technologies, most notably photography, but of course also lithography and even the new initiatives of woodblock printmakers. And this was all amidst a kind of rapidly changing ecology of images in the early Meiji period. And during this kind of rapidly changing era of the 1870s, Yuichi attempted to familiarize the physical properties of oil painting to domestic viewers, to sensitize his initial audiences to its muddy and yet glistening texture, and the ontological authentication of its truth claims that this somehow implied, this texture, the stuffness of oil painting. Now, re-examining this project today, in turn, has the potential to defamiliarize us to the texture of oil painting, to its odd thickness and brute substantiality, which we have perhaps become overly comfortable overlooking. Now, in order to provide a context for the discussion that follows, let me briefly survey Yuichi's career and his relationship to other developments in 19th century Japanese culture. Much of Yuichi's early life is shrouded in uncertainty and is perhaps not immediately relevant to us here. It is helpful to know that Yuichi was born in 1828, the same year as the Nihonga pioneer Kano Hogai, and adopted into a family of retainers in the Sano domain. He specialized in archery and fencing, but he was too sickly to take over the family line, and Yuichi instead trained to become a Kano painter. Kano, of course, meaning essentially the shogunal official painting studio of the time. But he eventually left the Kano to pursue the study of Western painting method. Now, as later accounts recall, sometime during the late 1840s, early 1850s, Yuichi was shown a European lithograph by a friend and was so hypnotized by its verisimilitude that he instantly became a devotee of the pictorial mode therein. From this point forward, Yuichi's acquisition of artistic skills was consistently unsystematic. In 1862, he joined the Bureau of Painting, the Gagakyoku, in what's translated as the Office for the Investigation of Western Writing, so the Banshoshi Dabesho, which is a strange shogunal institution that was founded in the wake of the arrival of the American Commodore Perry to Japan in 1853 and the Russian threat in Nagasaki in 1854. So there, oil painting was studied alongside map making and descriptive drawing in general as technical skills associated with European graphism and by extension with European military and scientific superiority. Now, apparently frustrated by his time at the Bureau, the Banshoshi Dabesho, where Yuichi didn't have the opportunity to study oil paintings firsthand, he supplemented his education with frequent visits to the port city of Yokohama, which had recently opened in 1859, and where he could seek out an English journalist by the name of Charles Wergman, whose paintings you see here. Wergman was a correspondent for the Illustrated London News, and he was an amateur painter, not of, as these paintings might suggest, not of too much distinction, but apparently able to impart some knowledge about oil painting materials and techniques to this occasional visitor, Yuichi. Now, with the Meiji Restoration of 1868, the study of Western representation actually lost shogunal sponsorship for almost a decade. And Yuichi was forced to embark on a career in a craft that was almost entirely devoid of an audience or of a public sphere in general. So during the period between 1868 and 1876, when a college of engineering that actually taught oil painting was established by the government, knowledge about oil painting was promulgated only in a handful of private academies, and these were established by people like Yuichi and some other painters associated with the Bureau, the Banshoshi Dabesho, the Bureau, like Kawakami Tokai. Now, this period, again, between 1868 and 1876, when oil painting was taught only in private academies, this period, I think, was crucial to the development of Yuichi's discourse, because in the absence of government support, he was forced to develop a sustained exposition of the many merits of oil in a framework that was both patriotic, nationalistic, and entrepreneurial. While Yuichi's output, although it's intriguing and idiosyncratic, it's not necessarily unique to the East Asian history of painting in oil, but his written texts cumulatively represent one of the most important bodies of discursive writing on oil painting in the history of the medium, and I would include Europe and non-Europe in that. And one of the main purposes of the written version of this presentation will be to explore some previously slightly neglected texts within this body of works, of writings. But from the mid-1870s onward, Yuichi's career was actually characterized by hard luck and increasing obsolescence, kind of one long decrescendo in terms of his stature in the oil painting world. Although his academy by the mid-1870s had over 70 students, and although he was occasionally accorded some honors, for example, he included 3 paintings in the Japanese pavilion of the 1873 exposition in Vienna. Yuichi was not, even though he had some of these, some small forms of recognition accorded to him, he was not necessarily considered at the vanguard of his craft. And in fact, I think he was already considered somewhat obsolete, even in the mid-1870s. When the College of Engineering opened, this is the Kobudai Gakko, and this is a picture of the first graduating class of the College of Engineering in 1876. When it was opened, the Italian painter Antonio Fontanesi was installed as professor of painting, and he established the first systematic academic instructional regimen for the acquisition of oil painting skills in Japan. And Fontanesi used a wide variety of standard Beaux-Arts teaching tools and taught students to sketch from plaster cast models in charcoal and crayon to pencil sketch from nature and produce landscapes and figure paintings in oil. I'm showing you here Fontanesi with his first graduating class, very devoted students. And this is some of the plaster casts he brought over from Europe still survive in the University of Tokyo collection. Here you have the discus thrower, which I imagine was a kind of, was a necessary model from which to sketch for classical Beaux-Arts training in the 19th century. Now, despite staying in Japan only 2 years, Fontanesi counted among his pupils many Japanese who would go on to be notable figures in Meiji oil painting, and these include names such as Koyama Shotaro, Matsuoka Hisashi, Asaichu, Yamamoto Hosui, Koseda Yoshimatsu, very prominent figures. And Yuichi was not among this group, he was not really accorded full membership in this group, although he occasionally would consult Fontanesi as an individual. His technique was quickly superseded by the Italians' pupils. So by the late 1870s, Yuichi's painting style had come to seem belabored and somewhat amateurish. Around the 1881 or 1882, furthermore, as many in this room know, the societal winds in Meiji had shifted toward a reevaluation of what we might call the intensive social engineering of the 1870s. And it resulted in a new appreciation of so-called indigenous cultural traditions. So antiquities began to be systematically surveyed, preserved. Study groups formed for the appreciation of classical painting. Eventually, a neo-traditional form of painting called Nihonga, of which we see a famous example here by Kano Kogai, emerged, one that selectively applied techniques of Western pictorialism to paintings in traditional Japanese and East Asian subject matter, and of course in classical formats and materials. In the meantime, the Kobudai Gakko, the College of Engineering, closed in 1883, and oil painting became the subject of increasing debate, negative commentary as well, even being omitted from the national industrial fairs held periodically in Ueno Park in Tokyo. Nihonga was championed instead by the leading aestheticians of the mid-Meiji and became the basis for the newly established Tokyo Art School, the Tokyo Bijutsu Gakko, in 1889. So amidst these rapid changes in the artistic landscape, Yuichi continued to paint and to author columns, reviews, and proposals, but became increasingly marginal to the yoga or Western-style painting movement. Even in 1889, when the leading oil painters in Japan banded together to form the Meiji Art Society, the Meiji Bijutsukai, the elder Yuichi was not even accorded a token role. In 1893, furthermore, Kuroda Seki, the figure that you see here, returned from a decade of art study in France to serve as a leader or rallying point for younger oil painters in the society. with his advocacy of a brighter palette, of looser brushwork, of plein air painting methods. Eventually breaking away to establish the influential White Horse Society, or Hakugagai, Kuroda was also invited to join the faculty of the Tokyo Art School in 1896. So he finally established a presence for oil painting there 2 years after the death of Yuichi. With Kuroda's ascension, older yoga practitioners came to be derisively, condescendingly referred to as the old school, Kyuha, or even the resin school, Yamiha, because of the darkened palette and heavy varnished glazes with which they were associated. And by this time, Yuichi was not even sufficiently relevant to be included as a target of these indignities. So again, I show you Kuroda Seiki's looking very smug here in this famous portrait and one of his famous plein air, brighter palette paintings. And I forgot to include, but this is just a portrait of Takahashi Yuichi at his 60th birthday in 1886. I show it because I feel it's showing his increasing resentment at the world around him. But it was not in it was in the post-war period that Yuichi's legacy finally really began to be assessed as something more than a historical curiosity. And not until the last 3 decades or so that he has been conceptualized as something more than an early utilitarianist. And again, Professor Poisson's work has played a leading role in this regard. A wide range of newly discovered works forced a reconsideration of his artistry as uniquely resourceful. The compilation of his complete writings by Aoki Shigeru engendered a new appreciation of his leading role in the formation of a public adequate to oil painting. And with historical distance, some of those painters associated with Yuichi's Academy have recently come to be recognized as some of the most inventive oil painters in modern Japan. And I'm thinking of figures such as Matsumoto Shunsuke, especially, who is, and these are considered much, much more interesting than the kind of orthodox lineage of Kuroda Seiki, who really, I think, dominated the institutional formation of the institutions of ink painting, of oil painting, in the early 20th century. The most important reconsideration of Yuichi is found in the work of Kinoshita Naoyuki, who has been responsible for examining the painter outside of the powerful and familiar teleology of yoga's institutional rise and societal acceptance, and for recasting his early to mid-career within the context of what he calls Nisenmono spectacle, or the popular entertainment culture of the Edo-Meiji transition. In this regard, Kinoshita departs from the institutional study of art and its administration that had been the emphasis of so much scholarship on Meiji culture in Japan in recent years. And Kinoshita focuses instead on the popular hybrid forms and practices that emerged in the wake of the importation of a culture of art, a culture of Bijutsu, to Japan in the 19th century. Thus, although Yuichi is often retroactively understood as a pioneer of art, or Bijutsu, his activity and output was experienced in his own time within the vernacular and vaudevillian environment of Nisenmono sideshows at low to middle-brow entertainment districts at local festivals in Edo, Tokyo. There, oil painting was a curiosity that competed for the observer's attention alongside puppet shows, comedic raconteurs, curio hawkers, and other exotic and entertaining Beaux-Arts practices such as stone sculpture. And I just gave you a small sampling of some images that evoke this culture of Nisenmono that Kinoshita Naoyuki has done more than it has really articulated over the last 10 years. And here you see, for example, of the so-called ikininyo, or living dolls, that were these incredibly lifelike dolls that begin to be made in the late Edo period. This kind of amateur sumo wrestling is a pair of dolls I think that was recently discovered in Detroit, and these keep coming up in Western collections where people kind of brought them back to anthropology museums and so forth. This is an example of an ikininyo, or living doll diorama, that was then commemorated in print. That's a large wicker sculpture of Huan Yu, the famous Chinese general, in an early 19th century print. Enormous wicker sculptural object. And this is probably the most interesting of all. This is a flyer by the a pair of painters, oil painters, Goseda Yoshimatsu and his son. And these are of oil paintings of familiar Japanese subjects in oil painting. And it's purposefully kind of advertising this as a kind of very strange, new, very similar mode of popular entertainment. This is this is what Hiroshita argues oil painting was in the 1870s in Japan. So Yuichi's work may have aspired to the status of an enlightening and westernizing technology, and eventually to that of a fine art. But for much of Yuichi's career, it had no other choice but to occupy the discursive spaces that were immediately available to it. Now, the emplotment of Yuichi's oil painting somewhere between spectacle, isemono, and art, bijutsu, serves as the starting point for my own assessment of his work. For although Yuichi has often been associated with the championing of oil painting as art, his discourse is ultimately oblique to the art agenda, and its interest lies precisely in its pre-art emphasis on the utility and truth value of the materiality of oil pigments per se. This emphasis, however, is best considered within the longer history of oil-based pigments in Japan, and that's what I'd like to talk about here as a preface to a further discussion of Yuichi's interest in oil painting. Oil painting was first systematically introduced, as we know, to Japan in the seminarios or painting academies established by Jesuit missionaries in Kyushu Island in the last decades of the 16th century. In contrast to their impact in China, however, the Jesuit presence in Japan did not result in a significant artistic legacy. Some people may argue that it didn't result in a significant artistic legacy in China as well. However, the Jesuit presence this was due in large part to the prohibition of Christianity in 1614, among other factors, of course. Dutch learning, or rangaku, provided a more long-term foundation for painting in oil-based pigments, but appropriate paintings and materials only occasionally entered through the port of Nagasaki. And very few painters during the Edo period actually produced works on canvas in a substance that we could really legitimately claim was oil painting. That was really close to what the European standard for the materiality of oil painting was in the Edo period. The history of Western-style painting in early modern Japan is less one of oil painting than what one might call oily painting. And in fact, recently Japanese specialists have begun to use the term oil-like or aguraefu in referring to this purpose. Now, and I'd just like to show you two examples of what we might call oily painting in early modern Japan. One is a famous portrait of a lady by Hidaga Gennai, a Dutch studies scholar from the 1770s. We'll return to this in a moment. This is a wonderful painting, probably the St. Peter with his keys, but it's probably the product of a seminario from the early 17th century. And it has an interesting history because it was rediscovered in a temple, in a Zen temple in Chiba Prefecture in the 1920s. And when it was rediscovered, it was actually labeled as a Shusang Shaka, or Shakyamuni descending the mountain. That was very typical for paintings like this. They were, labeled as something else so that they wouldn't attract attention, and then began to serve as a percolator to public attention in the 1920s and 30s. Edo period painters tended to produce an oil effect in one of three primary ways. The first was to mix traditional Japanese mineral pigments with oils that were indigenous to Japan, most commonly oil extracted from the gorilla plant, or shiso in Japanese. Shiso is something, of course, that in the Edo period was commonly used as a cooking oil. It's the most common cooking oil. And I think it's still, in all over East Asia this was the case. I think it's still true in Korea. Now, shiso oil was runnier than the highly viscous drying oils of early modern Europe, such as linseed or poppy seed or safflower or walnut or so forth. And these were often applied without other binders, primers, or varnishes, directly to paper or silk support. That's one method. A second method by which this oily painting effect was achieved was by resorting to an indigenous medium known as doroe, or paste painting, in which inexpensive mineral pigments were mixed with small amounts of water to generate a kind of thick, opaque paint that was used to decorate stage sets or shop signs in Edo period. And here I'm showing just an example of an Edo period sake shop sign using this doroe or paste painting technique that's in the Peabody Essex Museum. Apparently the glutenosity, the gumminess of Doro pigment was understood to be a reasonable counterfeit to the emulsive texture of paintings in oil. Even a classical technique such as Japanese litharge painting or mitsudae, associated with lacquer painting in which pigments were mixed with an emulsion of oil and heated like powder, could serve as a reference for Edo period oil painters. And indeed, in 1996 conservation and scientific analysis of the world-famous world map screens, and these are a pair of screens that are in the Imperial Household Collection dating to the early 17th century. A recent analysis found that actually lacquer was among the pigments used in his work. In fact, it wasn't the coloring, but it was the binding medium into which colored pigments were added. And most likely, this was the case for many products of the Jesuit seminarios. So in other words, in the Jesuit seminarios, we don't know what materials they were using, but probably, among other things, they were trying to replicate the effects of oil painting with traditional East Asian lacquer painting. And this is something that recent conservation scientists have been discovering in many different examples. A final technique by which an oil-like resemblance was achieved in the Edo period painting was simply to depict subjects in traditional Japanese materials and methods, but to add touches of animal glue or nikawa or tree sap binder to the surface upon completion. These touches added a certain luster that recalled the sheen of varnish and again represented a resourceful approximation of oil painting effects with local materials. We are only beginning to understand, thanks to the recent activity of conservation scientists in Japan, the inventive materiality of Western-style painters in Japan's early modern era. In the past several years, for example, the synthetic pigment Berlin blue, usually associated by art historians with Hokusai's 36 views of Mount Fuji and other landscape prints from much later, from the 1830s onward, has been detected in a wide array of 18th century paintings in Japan that were so-called Western-style paintings. And one example is a painting I showed earlier, Hiraga Gennai's Portrait of a Lady, which apparently makes abundant, this is by the Nagasaki painter Wakasugi Isohachi. This is by Hiraga Gennai, and another painting I'll show by Wakasugi Isohachi also makes abundant use of this Berlin blue, the synthetic pigment. Now, Berlin blue is, of course, a liquid dye that you don't usually associate with oil painting or the effects of oil painting, but it was thought to match what was imagined to be the kind of deeply saturated color of oil pigments in Japan, apparently. It was therefore accorded a privileged place on the Euro-pictorial palette. And its overseas origins, no doubt, further reinforced its suitability as a kind of surrogate for oil pigments. And I'm just showing you a close-up of Hiraga Gennai's portrait, for example, in the collar here. For years, people have been looking at this blue area with the collar, assuming it's some kind of blue oil painting or something. But it turns out to be actually Berlin blue, the synthetic dye, that was cleverly mixed and introduced, as you can see, underneath a white, oily pigment to kind of blend in and enhance the oily texture of the painting itself. And most interesting from my view is how the oily effect was resembled in paintings on silk, in especially the 18th century, through a traditional East Asian technique of pigmentation from the reverse side of the silk surface, what we call urazaishiki. And this was occasionally done to resemble a chiaroscuro effect. So, and this is, I'm just showing you one example. Many examples can be cited, like of Odano Nawatake's Two Young Children with a Dog, and this is a work in the Senju Museum in Akita. It shows, as you can see, it's clearly under the influence of Dutch studies, a typical Western-style portrait with somehow of Chinese subjects, Western-style painting of Chinese subjects. Important for our purposes is that if you look closely at the flesh tones of this figure, it turns out much of this glow is achieved by applying white ground-up shell powder to the reverse side of the silk so that it shows through the porous weave of the silk and creates this kind of dull glow from the front, a very sophisticated effect, very common in Buddhist painting. But this was thought to somehow approximate or get closer to this oily effect. Again, this perception of oil painting as an affect in Japan, resourcefully using all kinds of different techniques to get at it. So, such was the menu of options encountered by Yuichi when he began to study oil painting in the Shogunal Painting Bureau during the 1860s. His supervisor, Kawakami Kogai, who derived his knowledge of technique and materials almost entirely, he was somebody who learned everything from books. Yuichi complained later on of never having had the opportunity to even study model paintings under Togai. But his trips to Yokohama, as well as a 3-month stint in 1867 to Shanghai, under the sponsorship of his domain, not necessarily to study painting, but to study modernization in general, began to afford him more encounters with oil paintings. Indeed, Yuichi played an important role in bringing the visual culture of East Asian treaty ports to inland Japan. And I'm showing you 2 examples of just what I mean when Yokohama opens and other treaty ports open throughout East Asia. They develop these, of course, wonderfully hybrid forms like these, what are called in Japanese shashinga, or photo paintings, in which a photograph of a Western visitor is taken, and then that is used as the basis for a portrait in oil pigments, but in traditional Japanese dress. They could dress them up as anything they wanted to. Wonderful facial hair. And then this is, of course, so-called famous trade paintings of China that you see that are 19th century, that you see in Hong Kong and Shanghai and many other places. And it's interesting, this treaty port visual culture has more in common with each other than with its own countries. So I think Yokohama has much more in common in a certain sense with Hong Kong and Shanghai in this period in terms of these hybrid visual forms than with inland Japan. And in some sense, we could say that Yuichi kind of export art back to the interior of Japan after his encounter with these forms. These initial encounters may have given him a new appreciation for texture. Before then, Yuichi appears to have extrapolated and imagined an oil effect from older Japanese paintings, texts, and his own experimentation. His earliest works furthermore demonstrate an ad hoc approach to the matter of materials. Yuichi himself relates that in his formative years as an oil painter, he used traditional Japanese mino paper, minogami, perilla oil, the shiso oil that I mentioned, combined with shell white powder, ground up shell powder, gofu in Japanese, other local materials, and all were mixed on a sashimi platter with a cutting knife and lacquerware spatula, or rushibera, demonstrating the extent to which he made do with found resources. And there's a wonderful drawing from Yuichi's late years of the kind of palette and materials he used to, again, experiment with oil painting in his very early years. And I should say, this is just a sample from his diary or workbook in which you see him studying Western painting materials, poppy seed oil, something called crystal varnish, so on and so forth. Now, it was only after his instruction under Fontanesi in the late 1870s that Yuichi's technique and use of materials began to show some measure of consistency. Yet this stabilization also had the unfortunate result of normalizing Yuichi's painting into a kind of quasi-academic style. Now, Fontanesi himself has been described as a third-generation Barbizon master. And if this description doesn't quite excite you, well, you're not alone. You see some standard paintings by, these are, above is a painting by Fontanesi, and below here is a painting by Yuichi in the wake of his encounter with Fontanesi, his kind of academicization. Before what some have derisively called Yuichi's Barbizonization, however, Yuichi's painterly output had begun to shift in status from works that foregrounded method to works that foregrounded material. This evolution from exercises in illusionism to what one might call emotionism. Some people call this the move from Netherlandish painting to Venetian painting, but is most dramatically evident in Oidon, which is easily one of Yuichi's most visceral and affecting works. It's painted in 1872, and Oidon, of course, depicts a courtesan, of which Oidon was one of the highest ranks, dressed in decorative robes and an impressive full set of tortoiseshell hair ornaments. The sitter is shown according to typical conventions of beauty prints, or bijinga, of the Edo period, as a bust portrait in three-quarters pose. As many previous commentators have noted, a main purpose of the work was undoubtedly to de-idealize a common pictorial subject and thereby demonstrate the superiority and truth value of yoga in relation to traditional Japanese mediums. The meaning of Oidon was located, at least to some extent, in what it was not. It wasn't a a woodblock print, a floating world picture, or Yukio, a multicolor xylographic image in which you have an exoskeleton of the figure overlaid onto color planes. Instead, its courtesan subject was shown as a somewhat elderly woman without makeup. Ironically, this is achieved here by painting her unpainted face, staring meditatively or blankly in front of her. Rather than as a division of labor between lines and planes, like you would see here, something that we assume would have been more familiar to viewers in the 1870s. Her gaudy robes are depicted as a kind of organic and crumbled whole, with highlighting and modeling used to depict its bends and folds. Yet Oidon is much more than a de-idealized translation or transposition of a floating world subject into Western painting method. It contains an excess of pigmentation in its oily layers, which are built up into a remarkable surface-scape of thickly applied, unnecessarily accumulative stroke clusters. This impasto is impossible to convey in slides. I've tried, one method is to take a black and white photo with breaking light to show more of the surface-scape here, but even this doesn't, I think, convey the full materiality of Oidon. Usually this materiality is the most surprising element in live encounters with the painting. It is as if this demi-monde entertainer is depicted in relief, somewhere between painting and craft, between 2 and 3 dimensions. And although the portrait has also been interpreted as an homage to a hairstyle known as the Hyogo curl, which you see here, the Hyogo shitamage, that was characteristic somehow of a nostalgic and bygone era, it is as if the robes and other accoutrements were specifically chosen to showcase the full range of textures inherent in the oil painting medium as well. Thus, the animal spur depicting the mane of a mythic Chinese lion, or karashishi, on the courtesan's right sleeve is furry in the most painterly sense. The scales of the carp on its opposite sleeve glisten like varnish, and the tortoiseshell hair ornaments in the hair emit a certain brightness or luminosity, an embodiment of the qualities that made oil the illusionistic medium par excellence in European pictorial culture. The shim, or truth of the subject, seems to be captured in this thickness of the surface. Now, the idea of pictorial capture played a key role in Yuichi's evolving thought during the 1870s. During this period, as with the Hyogo curl, he began to paint objects that reflected a rapidly vanishing world, such as this still life of a suit of traditional Japanese armor, a painting that was discovered 20 years ago in the Yasukuni Shrine collection. For Yuichi, who was born into the warrior status group, the dismantling of the official status system in 1871 must have been a shock, and like many other members of his generation, he carried what we might call a status cling with him well into the Meiji period. Yuichi argued that oil painting was an ideal medium for the recording of a rapidly vanishing culture, as represented by the, by then, long obsolete traditional armor suit. In this regard, he was highly conscious of the emerging importance of photography, and in some cases, he specifically directed his polemic against photography. Oil painting, as opposed to photography, could last hundreds of years, and its colors wouldn't fade like photography. Moreover, it was much larger in size and could be displayed in perpetuity in public halls. Everything from the martyrs of the Meiji state to indigenous cultural identity could be preserved in it. Ironically, Yuichi argued for the use of a westernizing medium to preserve and monumentalize all that westernization was replacing. Somehow, the craft-like incrustation of oil gave it a more firm status as an instrument of recording. To be painted in oil was to be frozen in amber. At the same time that Yuichi hoped to capture and monumentalize the evanescence of Meiji society in oil, he was also keenly aware of the need to familiarize and even generate an audience for his work. He did so by producing a series of still lifes, again in the 1870s, that depicted familiar, everyday paintings in his viscous medium. And no work better captures the earnestness of this project than still life in Tofu, which is now in the collection of Otohira Shrine in Shikoku Island. Here you have 3 different types of the healthy bean curd laid out on a cutting board, regular, grilled, and fried, in order to convey a variety of different textures. Even the moisture of the cutting board surface is depicted here, as you can see this water leaking out of the tofu onto the board. Now, this type of painting, which is now considered an oddity, was at the time viewed as more polemical, arguing for and asserting its own relevance, forming and molding the very audience for which it was intended. Yuichi's tofu is very much about its own ability to depict tofu, and its unique and gelatinous texture is a texture that I would describe, for lack of a better word, as tofudy. I don't know if you eat that in Germany, but especially in the west coast of the United States, tofudy is all the rage. The crowning achievement of Yuichi's self-reflexive and didactic oil works has a detail that tries to convey some of the texture of the tofu here. And again, this doesn't do justice to the live encounter with the painting. The crowning achievement of Yuichi's self-reflexive and didactic oil works is undoubtedly Salmon. It's perhaps his most famous painting in the collection of the Geidai, or Tokyo University of Fine Arts and Music. Here, another subject of generic familiarity is chosen to convey the merits of its medium. In this regard, it is well chosen, as the texture of the fish scales is predisposed to highlight the properties of oily pigment, and exposure of the upper portion of the fish further stages its ability to depict the moisture of freshly cut fish and other challenging textures. Furthermore, as these details suggest to some extent, but again a direct viewing makes more obvious, the suspended salmon is covered with crests of welled-up pigment, a kind of superabundance of paint. Now, salmon speaks to the poignant historical reality that Yuichi was ahead of his time. Although treated today as an important moment in the early mastery of fine art painting in Japan, this kind of work was displayed at the time in so-called oil painting tea houses, or aburae chaya, in a sideshow setting. This work specifically was known to have been showed at a sideshow temple setting in a festival in Edo, alongside other paintings of sensational subjects, such as the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877. And this explains its trompe-l'oeil nature as well, because it's painted on paper, it was hung on a wall, and apparently originally had a nail through the top part of the rope to try to trick viewers. As attested by Charles Wergman's wife, furthermore, in its vertical format, Yuichi was attempting to accommodate potential patrons who would have likened its scale to that of a traditional vertical hanging scroll and would otherwise have had no place to display oil paintings in their home. And very interesting, recently a scholar, Omuka Toshiharu, has argued that, in fact, there was no critical mass of patrons for oil painting in Japan until the 1920s. Because there was no residential architecture that would accommodate it until this period. There's no widespread practice of establishing display spaces for this kind of painting in a traditional Japanese home until much later than previously thought. And it has recently been suggested, this is most interesting for me, it's recently been suggested that these paintings were accompanied by oral commentary by a kind of raconteur standing next to it, what in early Japanese film you call a benshi. Who provided live narration for silent films in the era. And no doubt, if this is true, no doubt these orators sensationalized the kind of hallucinatory verisimilitude, illusionism of these oil renderings, and provided a kind of performative counterpart to the thick, glutinous pigment that on the surface of salmon and other works like this. So, and these, of course, these works themselves contain their own sense of performance. So in its own time, instead of naturalizing oil painting to uninitiated viewers, these works must have ended up instead defamiliarizing familiar objects to bewildered onlookers. Now, as this paper has tried to argue, Yuichi's works from this period demand close attention for their testimony to modes of perceiving and conceptualizing the visual qualities of oil painting outside of a Beaux-Arts context. Although not always recognized as such, Yuichi's activities did succeed in calling much greater attention to the materiality of his champion medium in subtle but recognizable ways. The lacquer artist Shibata Zeshin, for example, his innovative use of lacquer painting, or urushie, which came in the wake of Yuichi's still lifes, was an attempt to achieve the texture of oil in a traditionally and seemingly related indigenous material, lacquer. His works similarly exaggerate their viscosity, and in some cases, I should show you Shibata Zeshin's lacquer painting. It's something that may have been a direct reaction to the encounter with oil painting. In some cases, they're so thick they resemble sculptural painting. I just wanted to show a particularly dramatic example of the kind of thickness of the texture of Yuichi's, the surface of Yuichi's paintings. This again is just taking a painting and presenting a detail of it in raking sideways light. Here we have Shibata Zeshin again. In addition, I would argue that Yuichi's brief but intense engagement with Ernest Fenollosa must have had the effect of turning Fenollosa off to oil painting once and for all. As is well known, Fenollosa would go on after 1881 or 1882 to champion Nihonga and attempt to articulate the properties of traditional Japanese artistic traditions. In particular, his discourse on the miraculous properties of wash technique in ink painting, which he and his circle would consistently refer to as notan, thick and thin, is kind of a wash gradation. It represents an interesting discursive counterpart to Yuichi's writings on oil painting. In the history of representation, Yuichi's paintings might be genealogized as a part of as of yet unmapped set of self-reflexive cultural practices that foreground their own materiality in non-European contexts, based upon encounters with the discursive regime of art and its institutions. This self-reflexivity is in some circles associated closely with Western cultural modernism, which is a product, of course, of genealogical thinking entirely internal to this tradition of cultural modernism, as some define it. But in this case, I think we might conceptualize Yuichi as something else altogether, as part of a phenomenon common to many artistic genres that avail themselves, in the wake of Western cultural hegemony, of non-native materials, and they develop a discourse to rapidly domesticate themselves. Whatever such an alternative history of material self-reflexivity might look like, Takahashi Yuichi will surely have a place in it. Thank you very much.